So today we're going to look at a very special rifle of the mid-19th century, which was truly revolutionary. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, so you have to pardon the pun. But this rifle truly is revolutionary because it's a revolver, but we'll get to that in a second. So obviously on this channel we often spend a lot of time looking at edged weapons, but I do sometimes look at firearms, and as you know I shoot black powder firearms myself. So in the middle of the 19th century, when we're looking at bayonets and cutlasses and sabres and all of these sorts of things, obviously the principal primary weapon of infantry is a firearm of various sorts. So up until about 1850, that is muskets, okay? So we had flintlock muskets through to about 1820, then everyone started switching over to percussion lock, like this one here. And then from the 1850s, lots of people started switching over to rifles. And in fact, by the time we get to the 1860s, they start to switch over to breech loaders. But even by the time of the US Civil War in the 1860s, most infantry are still using muzzle loading, that is the powder and the ball and everything else has to go down the front end, so you've got to put it down like that and get your ramrod out and load from here. Most people are using still mostly muzzle loaders, and they'd only recently switched to rifles, things like the Enfield rifled musket and the Springfield and so on and so forth. So really in the 1850s everyone switched to rifles. In the end of the 1860s and into the 1870s they started switching to breech loaders, which have a whole load of other advantages to them. But all of these have a fairly slow rate of fire. Many of you will know that in 1860 the Henry rifle came along, and this opened up the world of lever actions, and certainly in American history lever actions really took over. But there was briefly a type of rifle, which you've just seen here, which gave you the ability to fire multiple shots in quick succession. So when I say Samuel Colt, most of you immediately think of the Colt revolver, like this pocket model here. Now, in fact, the Patterson and early forms of Colt revolver had come around in the 1830s. They were really reaching their peak in the 1840s and were really quite common by the 1850s. So much so that people like the British government bought a load of Colt Navy revolvers prior to the Crimean War, and in the Crimean War many British officers had access to Colt revolvers, and Adams as well. That's another story for another time. But most of you will think of this as a Colt revolver. But indeed, Colt was also asked to make a rifle. And so in 1855-56, he did. Now, he'd almost certainly experimented with these prior to that, but this is the model, I think it's the model of 1856, yes, the patent of, this one's actually patented 1857, interestingly. Now, this particular example, which is lot 343 in the upcoming auction at Olympia Auctions here on the 25th and 26th of June 2025. This is a so-called British contract one. Now that's a bit of a confusing term because we'll look at its features in a second, but just a little bit of history. That some people are under the impression that these were somehow issued to the British Armed Forces, and they were never, as far as I can tell, they were never done officially. So they were known about and they existed, and there is some hint that there were some units in India who privately purchased these, and in fact there's one mention of a Colt's revolving rifle during the Indian Mutiny, and of course this is patented 1857, so it's the perfect time for the mutiny, which was 57 to 58. So fundamentally this was all about people trying to invent or have access to a rifle which was quicker to fire, and you could therefore deal with more opponents more quickly, and you didn't have to stop and reload. So obviously bayonets at this time primarily were important because of the slow rate of fire of firearms. And bear in mind that even most sailors and officers who had pistols, they were single shot pistols. Most of them didn't even yet have revolving pistols, and yet here we've got a revolving rifle. So Why didn't it take off? Well, fundamentally, there's a few problems with this idea. One of the main problems is the very propellant itself, the black powder. Black powder, when you use it, creates a lot of dirt and fouling, as it's referred to, which tends to clog up mechanisms. Now, this is also obviously a problem with pistols, but generally speaking at this time, if you're at pistol distance, you tend to use your 5 or 6 shots, and then whatever kind of nasty engagement you're involved in, either it's over by that point because the person who's attacking you is dead, or secondly, it goes to hand weapons like bowie knives or sabers or whatever. Rifles are a little bit different because with a rifle you want your infantryman to be at a distance from the enemy and constantly reloading and shooting. Okay? Now, if you've got a complex mechanism like this revolver here, if after 5 or 6 shots you're starting to get a build-up of fouling, now it takes a long time to reload that 5 or 6 shots, even with pre-prepared cartridges. But let's assume we've got pre-prepared paper cartridges. They go in the front, you use the rammer, we'll look at that in a second, you load them. Okay, great, you can now go again. You might get off a second cylinder, but by that point the fouling, at least according to writings that I've seen of the period, suggests that the fouling in these starts to become so bad that it becomes difficult to continue reloading and firing. Now at this point you've only shot maybe 10 or 12 shots, which isn't an awful lot for an infantryman engaged in war. So, these absolutely did have some advantages. The rate of fire was pretty much unparalleled until the lever action came along. But the problem was if you were in line infantry and expected to stand there and shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot, they couldn't keep going because of the complex mechanism. Right, so who did use these? Well, potentially the British used them to some extent. This one actually has Victorian proof marks on, so any firearms which came into Britain, let's see if we can see them, any firearms that came into Britain there, so each cylinder is proofed, and had the British government sort of proof mark put on it, because obviously guns were coming in from lots of different countries, so you didn't always know the quality of the metal. Incidentally, British steel at this time was so highly regarded that Colt actually imported English steel into America to make firearms with, and then sent the firearms back. But you have to bear in mind at this time as well that Colt briefly, for a couple of years in the 1850s, actually had a factory making guns in England, in London. So that he got out-competed by native gun companies, but nevertheless, he had great interests in the British gun trade, and bear in mind, of course, that the British Empire at this point was the biggest global empire, so it was a major buyer of firearms. So this gun came around because there was an appetite for a faster loading rifle. It works pretty damn well, and it works on exactly the same principle as a Colt revolver. So half cock, full cock, it's now ready to shoot. Obviously I won't shoot it, but release down, bam, onto the percussion cap, and it shoots. In terms of loading, you load usually pre-prepared paper cartridges into the cylinder, and then you've got, it's a little bit stiff, especially with gloves on. There we go. There we go. We've got the rammer, which works on exactly the same principle as other Colt rammers, which rams down the cartridge deep into the cylinder. And this is a fairly large caliber as well for a revolver, but not really for a rifle, and that's another important point. So this is actually .56 caliber, which might sound big if you're used to revolvers, because usual pistol revolvers, certainly Colts of this time, tend to be either .31, .36 or .44. So a .56 sounds really big and powerful, doesn't it? Well, but not really. So there's a couple of issues here. So if we compare with a musket of the time, two things. First of all, they tend to be even bigger caliber, okay, .58, .65, things like this. So, and even up to .7 whatever. So muskets and rifled muskets tend to be a larger projectile, larger caliber ball. But secondly, they also have a colossal great chamber, essentially. You put a big charge, many drams of powder down one of these single shots ones, whereas down the revolver, although this is much bigger than a pistol, you only have a limited amount of space to put powder into one of these. So they're never going to be as powerful and they're never going to shoot as large a projectile, bullet or ball, as a musket or a rifled musket of the time. So the upshot of that is that while you have something which, yes, in quick succession, cock, shoot, is way quicker to shoot than other rifles and muskets of the time, it can't go as far. It's at far distance, it's not going to be as accurate, and when it does get to its destination, it's not going to do as much damage as a typical army rifle or musket would do. So overall, you might be getting the impression that I'm saying this is a rubbish rifle, and actually I don't think that at all. I think it's an amazing rifle because it was a very important innovation that gave you a rate of fire that was unparalleled until the lever action rifle came along. It was amazing, and certainly in sort of civilian use or perhaps ranching and things like this must have been an amazing weapon to have at the time. But it doesn't really work very well for military use, for standard militaries, for all of the reasons I've explained here. That being said, we do know that some of these were used by the British military kind of semi-officially, not really adopted officially. And we do also know that the Confederates made use of these during the American Civil War as well. But in fairness, the Confederates did make use of shotguns and anything else they could get their hands on. So that's not necessarily a great testament, but it is nevertheless a fascinating, I mean, I absolutely love it. I love the fact that it operates exactly like my Colt Dragoon, which I love, but it's in rifle size. So I think this is an absolutely wonderful thing. And while it's not the be-all and end-all of military technology in the sort of with the powers of hindsight, at the time it was a really amazing innovation. So thanks once again to Olympia Auctions for hosting me and letting me film some of their amazing things. Check out that catalogue down in the description. The sale's on the 25th and 26th of June 2025. Got some wonderful things in it, and what a pleasure to be able to get my hands on them and talk about them and share them with you. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers folks!